Great. Any major concepts people want to make sure I mean, you can do it as we go. All right, then we're going to move on to next steps. So first, I'm going to, and Rebecca, I need you to listen in just a second, but I believe that at the end of this, a book is produced. And I believe that that book is, first of all, is it titled this, or can we change the title? So we can change the title, so we're going to have to discuss that. And that book really just is a summary of what was said here. So the conversations that we had, the presentations that people gave, you've seen these. There's some sitting out there, so you can see what they look like. In it will also be the listing of trials, the landscape that has been put together already. And I'll say, though, that doesn't have to be the landscape that gets out in the document. We know that there were some trials that were mentioned here, sometimes with some details, sometimes with a veil of secrecy. But we think that those should be put in as much as can be shared. And obviously, if they're in clinicaltrials.gov, then, and they should be, then they're public. So we should be able to say more about what is, what the specific elements are that make them trials that fit. Now, I want to go back to that. That's a snapshot of today, and maybe that's the most important thing. That's what we thought was important from the drug forum, that when we decided this needed to be put together, is to tell people where we are today and to start to get people to share those learnings. So that may be all that's needed, or what's been brought up is that maybe we need a system to keep that updated, to share more rich information about how things are done and how they can be done. So I'm going to just table that component and say we need to get to that one, and that was brought up and down this aisle too. The regulation thing, we definitely want to talk about and say, well, what can we do as a group? Not things will be put in this document, but we also have the potential to splinter off in groups that choose to advocate through the variety of different organizations that are represented here, and ones that aren't. But then everyone has mentioned this sort of ontology and the naming thing. So actually, my first thought was, let's just delay that. There's no way a room like this is going to come up with a name for this. But I think we actually have to deal with it up front. And not that we need to come up with that ontology or framework, but I think we all ought to maybe share a few ideas about it, and then think about what process might make sense going forward to create that ontology so we're all using the same language. So if okay with you, Steve, I'm going to frame this and then let everybody talk and give their thoughts about it. So first of all, just so you know, we struggled with this name, virtual clinical trial, quite a bit, and we had several different names that we tested, and we weren't happy with any of them. We weren't happy with decentralized because we said, well, they're more centralized. More things are happening at the center site and less at the site, so they're not decentralized. They are not digital health enabled. I mean, sometimes they are, but that's only one element. They can be different in many other ways. So really, what makes them different? So here I'm gonna just give a little background. So before I decided to be a doctor, I was going to be an architect. So excuse my architectural references here, but in architecture, you had classical architecture until and people followed standard rules without really questioning for a long time. There was some evolution, incremental evolution of architecture. And then you had this movement to modern architecture, right? And it was a more dramatic movement. It was saying, let's design around core principles, the way people live, the way they should live, the way they like light. And it took the technologies of the time, but it wasn't just about technology. It was about rethinking how architecture is put together. And I think that word modern is then subsequently applied to all kinds of things, right? And I actually think that could work here as an umbrella. So we have, and let me tell you, I mean, I'm just throwing it, I'm not saying this is what we do, but if you think about what modern does, you have a modern building, you could say that's a modern building, maybe done purely, but you also have modern elements. You have modernization. You have the ability to change certain elements to say that those elements are modern. So it doesn't, you've got a purity, but then, which we don't know what that looks like, but then you have variations of that, and we know that that's going to be required in this transition. But the other thing about it is it creates a kind of push from the current state. So if you're not modern, what are you? Postmodern. You're pre-modern. Well, because we haven't had modern yet, you can't be. Yeah, you can't be postmodern yet. You have to be classical or
feudal right now. I got to tell you, FEU,
feudal, whatever. It's
from the ground point of view.
So if you think about it that way, then modern actually creates a push that other terms like virtual does not. Virtual has this sense of kind of loosey-goosey, and you think of people going around looking like this, and it doesn't really convey what it is we're trying to. And digital health is only one component, as we said before, and that term's going to be trendy and go away, right? Modern has the potential to be interpreted differently and to create an umbrella. That doesn't solve the ontology problem. I totally recognize that. But then what it does is it creates underneath it the ability to produce adjectives or subcategories that describe the elements that are going to need to be mixed and matched in order to produce the variety of different, modern trials. So I'm throwing it out there just to get reactions, but you don't have to react on that. You can say that's crazy. And yes, Stevie.
Yeah, Clay, of course, I've been thinking about this a lot, and you and I have been talking about it a lot, and that there isn't going to be one word that covers all the characteristics that are important. So we've got one word for snowflake, and I imagine, as I'm told, the Eskimos have 40. Flexible or modern makes sense as some sort of umbrella. I like the idea that there's more flexibility now in what we do, where we go, where we do it. Like Craig was saying, they could be, Craig, what was your term? Multiple. Location flexible. But I think that one critical element, from my point of view, makes a big difference, and that's whether people are going to be recruited to a physical site, bricks and mortar site. Because if that's not the case, then you have to use a lot of other tools to stay in touch with them, and it makes a big difference not only to recruitment, but how you do stuff. And so I think that characteristic is unique to some kinds of trials, and they are called, I guess, sometimes the pure virtual trials. I'd like to see a term for that disconnection. Sightless sort of sounds like the wingless insect that we study in genetics, so I don't like that. I do like direct to participant because that's more active. It's going directly from some single place to participants, and or some other characteristic that describes that. No more bricks and mortar sites, necessarily. That's one. But then there's the whole part about virtual data collection. And that is, once you've done that, it doesn't have to be a trial. It can be any study that has where you're using technologies that are digital. I think that's what virtual says. They're image, they're other digital technologies, they're mobile technologies. So the word virtual, I think, kind of works for virtual studies, where it's talking about the nature of the data collection from participants. And maybe I would sort of suggest that if the primary measurements, primary outcomes, for example, in a trial are going to be the digital data coming from participants in passive or even active ways, that's a virtual study. And it's making use of technologies that allow you to do things in a virtual fashion. And it doesn't have to be, therefore, a study free of sites. You can have a virtual study that is direct to participant or siteless or not. And so it's essentially the point that we're trying to make one term cover everything, and I don't think that's going to be as helpful as making some lexicon that's really clear about what makes the biggest difference and how the measurements are done. This virtualization, I think, is really important, and whether there is recruitment to a physical site or many physical sites is another really important characteristic. So I'd like to have a term for each of those. And then an overall umbrella of, flexible, postmodern, all fine.
So I like modern or contemporary, and so if you have modern clinical trials, I think you need to have modern guidances, modern rules or legislation, and then modern governance. So I think modern guidance, I think it would be great if the FDA put out guidance around these new sets of clinical trials. They can be very impactful. They could largely adopt what the city has developed in partnership with the FDA. Modern policies, I think the licensure one is a big one for distributing investigational drugs. And the people who lose in this aren't docs. There's enough New Yorkers with Parkinson's disease to keep me happy for a long time. The people who lose are participants in areas where there aren't docs. So if you're in Wyoming or Arkansas, until recently I was the only Parkinson's disease specialist for Delaware. Those are the people who lose out. And there's precedents for federal governance of this. The VA allows basically any VA beneficiary to receive care from any VA doctor. I think it's true in the Department of Defense. Clinical trials are governed by the FDA, a federal body. And the last one is governance. So, we've started putting participants or individuals affected by diseases on steering committees, but increasingly these trials are going to happen outside of medical centers, where doctors like Clay and I kind of run the ship. But these are happening, conversations, we're capturing data from people in their real world settings, in their homes. I think you need to have a lot more representation and sometimes even leadership from those in the community who are most directly affected by these. I think it also take the burden off the IRBs to say that this study is being governed by people who are with the condition, who are at risk for the condition. I think it addresses a lot of the privacy issues. And the idea about having patients on DSMBs, I think that falls within that. Thanks.
So just to the topic around naming, clearly there's no name that's going to make everyone happy. Every single name has its compromise to it. I do just want to share one comment in defense of decentralized trials, the jargon that Citi had used, because there is centralization, and that's the enabler, but it's really the decentralization that's created by the fact that things are being centralized is what we're really talking about here. The energy and enthusiasm in this room is less about, isn't it exciting that now we can do central reads of all the data or have a central PI? It's really about the decentralized aspect of then enabling improved access and more gateways for participation. So I wouldn't throw that name off the list just yet. There is something nice about if Citi and the National Academies both use the same term, that's the term now that I think people can start to agree and rally around. And just to double down, I think, Clay, you said it earlier, that theme around more ways for information sharing and keeping it fresh. I just wanted to do one yes and on top of that. We talked a lot about risk aversion, and that holds companies and research sponsors and research entities back. That same risk aversion plays both ways. So the more evidence that starts to get stacked up that this is not only feasible and can be done, but there's more evidence that others are doing it, now the risk flips. And by exposing that and having transparency around it, now the risk is that you're not doing it. And so you can then start to leverage that same risk-averse culture in the opposite direction, only if you have more sharing and transparency like you were describing.
Hi, my name is Rodrigo Garcia, and I'm the head of clinical applications and innovation within EMD Serrano. My comment would be, I agree with what has been said before. I think there's not going to be one term, but I do like to go to the origins of nomenclature when it's classic versus modern. I think makes sense. For me, the important thing is that we should always remember that we're trying to leverage technology to really transform clinical trials to make it more transformational, right? Not such a transactional activity in which the investigator learns a lot from the patient's disease, but the patients really, they don't get a lot except study drug, right? I think now we're really trying to transform the experience in which now, and we've been hearing this for the last 2 days, patients are getting access to their data. They learn from their data. They learn from other patients that are participating in the clinical trial. So for me, I think technology, decentralization is just a way of trying to finally bring the patient to the focus, and the patient will gain even more than what we are trying to learn from there. So for me, that's the part that if you're trying to have a modernize studies because you're transforming research for the focus of the patient, right? Thank you.
Hey, I'm Andy, and I don't know if anyone has read the BEST framework. So the FDA and NIH came together because they had a similar issue around biomarkers and figuring out how to actually define what these things are. So BEST is biomarkers, endpoints. The S comes from endpoints and tools. And I know, cute. And one of the things that's really, so naming is hard, and one of the things that's really nice about putting a stake in the ground around names is it allows people to say the same sort of thing. So the fact that the first speaker talked about, I think there are at least 2, maybe more things people talk about here. One is location or not, and then 2 is whether or not the data is collected digitally. So I think there's actually at least 3 names. There's the umbrella name, there's a name to talk about the site, and then there's at least a name to talk about data location. And so as you're thinking about this, one thing that would be useful is not just name, but list out like what's the inclusion-exclusion criteria, so then people can use the right terms, that we don't just use the umbrella term for it. So for example, like if we want to talk about pragmatic studies, like would those fit in here? Does that fit because somebody wants to talk about it from a site location, or this helps us get language. I like decentralized if I had to vote for the umbrella term. I think there are specific ones underneath that we can talk about. But just to make everyone laugh, I'm pulling up a tweet that I got, which was, I was asking somebody what to name it, and they said, can we name it hyper-local, patient-centric, on-demand, mobile-based RCT? Or is that too wordy?
So I have one thought, and I've sort of been reluctant to step up and say it because it seems on one hand too obvious and on the other maybe just a little too much. Some of the impetus behind some of the things that are coming out of the federal agencies right now are happening as a result of the 21st Century Cures Act, which was very clear about wanting to see 21st century trials. So I'm just wondering whether, as an umbrella, we might just simply say, this is what the characteristics of 21st century trials will look like, and then have modules within that describe the characteristics of it, describe the specific types, if it's decentralized or if it's a hybrid. And so being able to actually harness the power of that term that's already familiar across federal agencies, and many of them are trying now to meet the mandates that are required of that, but put it in the context of trials. So just throw it out there. And again, as I said, I was sort of like, oh, it seems like just too obvious or just maybe too silly, but it just seems like it hits the mark on modern as well as contemporary, but also recognizes that the 21st century has introduced us to the iPhone. It has introduced us to things that we didn't have before. So,
and one friendly amendment, do we want to say studies instead of trials?
Yeah.
Some things are trials, some things are studies.
Just because, especially because the way California legislation makes the trial, it's get out of jail, but a study, an observation study would.
No, to the point that it sounds like that a clinical trial in California gets you out of the California data protection, but a study, an observational study, wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously these principles would apply to trials and other kinds of studies. Whether we change our title to studies, I mean, the intent here was really to focus on clinical trials where we saw the greatest gap and greatest potential opportunity.
My name is Khalid from the FDA. I would like to propose a new term. So considering the speed at which science is evolving, technology is evolving as well, what is innovative today will not be innovative probably in 5 years or maybe less. How about we use the term next generation clinical trials? So a successful example for we have, like you mentioned, the iPhones or the Samsung, they have iPhone 1, 3, 4, and 10. So, and it keeps evolving. The people expecting a new iPhone or a new number to, and the same thing, another example we have on genomics. When we have next generation sequencing. And we are expecting that it's probably technology is evolving and maybe the name would change a little bit more. So I think that would keep it flexible in terms, like maybe it will be a third generation of clinical trial after that. That would happen.
Great. I mean, that was another one that we had discussed, and I think it's another. I mean, all of these are great ideas. 2.0 was the other one. The notion, though, is that some of these are how are they going to test over time? Are they going to seem trendy in retrospect? Maybe that's okay, because the point you made is correct. The things are going to continue to evolve, and then this will be next generation. Then one after that will be who knows what, hyper generation, patient, whatever. And then they've got their set of terms that they can use. But the one thing too, I just want to say that I think we should be thinking about for whatever umbrella term, and I grant you it's an umbrella term, is whether it produces motivation. So one appealing thing about the potential for the terminology is to say you're being left behind because you're not doing these things. So actually better than modern and classical would be modern and traditional. I'm doing a traditional clinical trial. That sounds kind of, wow, really? I'm going to fund that thing? So I do think if we can think about that, because that is, there's real power in that aspect of it. And that whatever umbrella term we use, it's not really going to be that meaningful. It's the adjectives underneath that we're talking about that I think will really be the defining features.
Raj Sharma from HealthWiz, not to muddy the waters more, but decentralized has another reference, and that's with blockchain. So blockchain is a decentralized technology. And it might seem that blockchain has nothing to do with clinical trials, but it actually, I think, is going to play a big role when it comes to clinical trials. And the reason is that data integrity and data provenance seems to be a big problem that the clinical trial industry wrestles with all the time. And one or two things that blockchain does really well is help establish data provenance, especially in case of virtual trials, and data integrity. So once you put some data on a blockchain, there is no way you can change it. So I think blockchain, which is a decentralized technology, is going to play a big role in clinical trials, and that's the other reference that decentralization has.
I don't want to be cited as saying this because I kind of hate this adjective, patient-centered or patient-focused. So I don't want it to be called patient-centered or patient-focused clinical trials, but I think in the messaging, we're kind of changing the nexus of where the location is and the kind of design is where it should be on the patient. So if we can get that in there, I'm trying to, without doing Andy's friend's tweet, it's about where the patient is, and it's 21st century, moving it to where the person is, but I don't want it to be called patient-centered.
First of all,
yeah, well, but it can't be. Then I know a lot of patients who are going to expect it to come to them where they,
Consumer-centered, clinical research, C3R.
I was going to say, sort of, no matter what the term is, this, coming from the open science world, we have this problem where no one agrees on what open science is or what it does or why it's good. There's this sort of vague religious belief that it's better, right? And what we try to do at SAGE is not define what we think it is for the world. We say, here's what we mean when we use this word. So whatever word we choose at the top, let's say what we mean by it. And so I think what's more important to me than the actual word is saying that it's composed of the following elements, and it can be all of one of them or a hybrid of many of them. And this is what we mean by it. And frequently that is more effective than anything else, because most of the other people using those words don't say what they mean. And so that is sort of a meta comment about ontology, which is that sort of saying what you mean and how you use it is often as important as the actual word.
Great. So all great input. We're not going to solve this in this room. Maybe we'll just ask Andy to solve it on Twitter for us. And but I think these are great ideas. And with the planning committee and some others, we'll come up with some framework, and it'll be reflected in whatever title you all see of the book that comes out. And then in terms of, maybe I'll just say it. So that. Well, what do you think, Rebecca? I'm just thinking about, it would be nice to have the NAM says this is the ontology that should be. It's one of the great things that the NAM can do. Should we kick that to the forum? Would that be a logical place to do that? Or Carolyn, you want to talk about it? Either way. And so maybe while you're going there, I'll just explain. So the drug forum is the parent place where this idea came about and was initially put forward. The two of us are on that. I don't know if others in the room are on it or not, but it brings together academia, nonprofits, government, and the nonprofit foundations and for-profits, and so a lot of CMOs from companies are on that, and it looks at the whole landscape of what's going on in terms of development in biomedicine, and tries to think about where we can move the sort of national agenda forward. And so this is one of the kinds of products that comes from that. And so it does produce documents that reflect the beliefs of that organization, but it's not like you're appointed or assigned NAM task force. So I don't know, Rebecca, what do you think?
Sure. You said it well, but I think the drug forum could be a great place to take this topic to. I'm sure, realizing that we don't have everybody in the room who has an opinion about this, that would be a great next step. So yes, okay. I agree.
All right, good. And I was looking at Julianne, but I'm thinking we're going to probably assign City some other functions. We can't do that, but discuss what City might pick up as a next step for some other things. So we won't put this one on City's plate. Great. Good. So then we're going to leave behind the ontology naming thing, and now move on to some of the other things. So Ray introduced them. We've all heard different parts of them. Maybe I'll take what I think will be the easier one, although I don't know what the solution is, first, which is the landscaping, the shared knowledge base. So it's pretty clear, just the state of where we are today is important, and we'll get that out to some extent through the proceedings of this symposium. But that's a snapshot, and it won't include a lot of information that's being developed right now or that exists outside of that knowledge. And John, during the break, you mentioned the knowledge that was developed around how to deal with HIPAA in 50 states, and how important that would be to many, many people. But there's no place where that's shared. So I think it's a good point. So who can do that, and where should it sit, and how does it get updated, and ideas?
So I actually thought you were going to go a little bit broader than that.
Go broader.
So I have been most intrigued, and I'm a policy wonk by predisposition, by the policy challenges in this terrain. So HIPAA is one of those.
Yeah, I was saving that for last.
Okay, then I'll shut up.
I saw this as an easier problem.
HIPAA is always the easy.
Yeah, so no. I wasn't saying let's look at HIPAA. I was saying, where do we share all of this knowledge? How does it get shared?
So are you envisioning,
that's what I want to...
Clay, that's something that a consortia takes up, like City or Transcelerate, or a nonprofit in the space? I'm looking at Sage, or is this something that a university we would look at, maybe to take up at least maintaining some sort of open knowledge repository? Where were you leaning?
That's any of the above. So I mean, I think each of those is a possibility. The other would be, is there a journal that takes this on as as part of their mandate, and then but it has to be learnings along the way. It's not just publication of a clinical trial. It's more free form than a typical journal would look at.
She's looking it up to see if they can do it.
So as a follow-on to our mobile clinical trials program work, we're actually putting together an online resource of feasibility studies using mobile technologies. The initial data that we're putting on relates to published examples. So that's where we've scoped so far. So I can say what we're doing and that it is coming. I don't know. It sounds like we can get it pretty broad here, and I don't know how broad City could take on, but that is an activity we're actively working on.
The NIH collaboratory was also mentioned as a potential vehicle for distributing this. Would that work?
Yeah, it's a possibility that the resource portal that Wendy spoke about and the NIH Research Collaboratory yesterday might be another way to do that. She also offered up the possibility of people speaking at their weekly Grand Rounds talks about lessons learned in any given clinical or observational virtual study that's been done. So, I mean, to the extent that there would be a desire to have, sharing of this, Wendy would be a good person to follow up with and see how could this actually be implemented. And then I think they may even be video recorded for people to watch later. So, but Wendy would have the full information about that.
If I can add, I think we can use some of things that have already been in place and are well known, such as Transcelerate, for example. But I think it will be also a good idea to partner, if you will, with the FDA or with NIH to make it from a broader perspective and make sure you're providing the information not only that pharma wants to provide, but also other functions or other partners are also getting and contributing information, right? Thank you.
I just want to throw out it's both a question and a suggestion, I guess. The Drug Forum has done some fantastic work over the last several years. It's really been helpful to a lot of us that are trying to understand things. The drug device industry doesn't seem to have a device forum at the NIH, or at the NAM. But NEST and an awful lot is going on there. And in many ways, devices have a greater need for real-world data, real-world evidence, because it's so hard to do clinical trials with placebos, devices, and so on. And I wonder if some kind of a consortium of a drug forum and a device forum kind of entity might be appropriate. One of my guiding principles in all of this is that there is only one real world out there, where all we're doing is just looking at pieces of it here and there and everywhere. And so it's got to gradually start coming together into one whole patient-centered universe. There certainly is no sense allowing device thinking and drug thinking to go on in separate silos. We want to really bring them together in terms of, particularly in this case, how they collect data.
Well, that's a structural suggestion for the NAM. There is no device forum currently, and one could bring that back to the drug forum as well. The name would have to change. The modern forum. Okay, well, this one I don't think we're going to resolve, but we've had a number of different suggestions. And I mean, who thinks this is a bad idea, that we don't need to do something to get information and shared? So no one's raising their hands that it's a bad idea. I framed it that way, so you'd actively have to raise your hand. So we'll get together and think about that, the planning group again, and think about the various alternatives. I mean, the one nice thing about the publication model is there are incentives in place that everybody understands in order to share. The academic incentives are in place, the way that publishing mechanisms work. Dissemination is a key function of publications. So you don't have to reinvent a whole structure to support the dissemination. There are also financial models that support that. So that may be the simplest structure to keep it going. Ray Dorsey left, right? So he created that journal, but it's called Virtual Biomarkers, Digital Biomarkers. Thank you. And so that he'd have to rename that for it to be satisfying. But at least there's something out there that's in a similar space. Okay, good. Then that was another easy one. So now we're going to move to the really hard stuff, and that relates to the regulation. So now, Kathy, your turn. Take us broad.
Well, so there were a couple of issues that were mentioned that stand in the way of modern trials, but I also think they stand in the way of traditional trials as well. So there's probably broader applicability to doing some thoughtful policy analysis and recommendations, which I realize is way outside of the realm of the possible for the drug forum and making overt, bold, energetic policy recommendations and then advocating for their adoption. But I think that there's a lot of fodder here, both the being able to prescribe, being able to get study drugs to participants was a big issue. Devin, laid out a whole host of issues around privacy and various conundrums that are locked up there that I think we could take on. There was probably others that we, probably some around patient inclusion in various regulatory bodies and governing bodies, the suggestion that there be a patient on a DSMB. That could be a guideline or a policy that's adopted by the NIH and others. So I think there's probably others, but those were ones that came to mind.
And John, while Devin's going to the microphone, you had some ideas about this as well.
I mean, I think for most of it, it's really about the harmonization at the state level, right? I just think that's, you see this in HIPAA with states that have HIPAA minus and HIPAA plus, and some of them are before HIPAA and some of them are after HIPAA. I mean, one of my favorite examples of this is the variation on expiration of authorization for sharing genetic data, right? Like, I think Louisiana's 90 days, right? So you can only authorize your genetic data for like 90 days if you're in Louisiana. And so anyone running a study that enrolls people in Louisiana has to deal with the fact that the authorizations will expire like years before the other people in the study. And so you have to build this incredibly complex technical infrastructure. And to me, it represents a form of regulatory capture. And so, we're going to be open sourcing all of the stuff from the All of Us program because it's a federal work. Program's intended to create public assets. We've got all the tables, all these things, but like building the tech to actually manage that is really hard, right? Illinois requires a witness on the consent form for a generic enrollment in an observational study. So you've got to build tech that lets two people sign, right? And this is the simple stuff. This is just the consent stuff. This doesn't get into prescription rules and dispensing rules and compounding rules. And so some form of harmonization, or at least a safe harbor to experiment, right? If you don't want to do harmonization all the way, you could at least create a safe harbor that says, if you're doing a hyper-global CompuMegaNet trial, right, that you're in a safe harbor. You can apply to a safe harbor where there is some harmonization, right? Something that lets us at least start doing stuff and see what works, right? Validate and then teach and give back the validated methods. That's sort of where I'm coming from the regs perspective.
Can I pile on really quickly?
Yeah, go for it.
A lot of the state laws, and especially the genetic protection state laws, I think starting in Oregon, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, were really put in place out of patient concern about their privacy and discrimination. And now, if you look across those rules, and I think it's also true of mental health as well, that we are now hitting up against those rules preventing those populations from participating in research that can benefit them. So, having really active patient leadership in this policy discussion is going to be critical, rather than being led by we policy wonk.
Yeah, this is Devin McGraw. I agree with all of that. But given that it does take time to get rules changed, and it is totally worth the effort, and the more sort of multi-stakeholder agreement you can get on changing something, the better your chances are. I think ultimately what will probably sink the current privacy conversation in Congress is what has historically sunk it, which is that there's agreement at the top level. Oh, we need to do something about this. But then when you start to sort of look at the more specific proposals, there's a lot of disagreement. And it could be that there are many things upon which the members of the Drug Forum could not, become coalesced around, but there are other things that could. And I think it's worth pursuing whether there are some things that would speed the pathway to all of this, that you could get collective agreement on. And state laws, can be quite problematic. What I was going to suggest, and if you've got something on that I can pause, but I was going to suggest simultaneously, the more that we can put out, and this is actually to the sort of education of the stakeholders topic that was the prior one, which is, again, compliance officers don't want to go out on that limb by themselves. If there's not official guidance coming out of the relevant agency on how to do something, or there is official guidance and your thing doesn't quite fit, right? It's a little bit like that question, but it's not totally addressed by the guidance, which happens all the time. It is enormously helpful when not only is published what happens in the study and what are the results of the study, but the process points down to the level of how did we navigate which apps and devices we were comfortable using with respect to collecting this data from individuals. What did we decide that we would do about the passive data collection that occurs by the vendors of these apps? How did we resolve that question? How did we resolve the issue of the state law matters around drug dispensing? How did we get over that hurdle? Like, that's a piece that when people see that, they say, oh, then I can do that too. Then I know that it worked and the sky didn't fall on these people. And that's, whether that's a city or some other sort of way for that to sort of get published and then continually added to as people's experiences evolve, could also be helpful.
So, Kathy, you articulated what I was thinking when we were talking about the Drug Forum and a lot of these other existing endeavors. They're not really multi-stakeholder. The patients are still, or the people are still on the outside. I think we need modern patient advocacy or modern patient activism in a grassroots way. The way
the way we used to do it. We could do a statewide campaign. I mean, and you remember, I mean, you know, I'm just thinking about Jane Reese Colburn, who is not here, who called herself the Methuselah of patient advocacy. And if I could do something in her honor, I will. But that's what we need, because patient advocates as they exist today aren't aware of a lot of this. They can catch buzzwords and go online and put their thumb up, but we need an education organization, a movement, so to speak, and I don't know if it can reside where you are to do policy work, but we need it, and I think we have a lot of people who were around before who know how to do this kind of campaign stuff.
Just want to pick up on a thread that Devin had started that, you know, back in 2009 when we were planning for the remote study, we racked up a ridiculous number of hours of lawyers talking to state medical and pharmacy boards, all of which we've shared with others, the output, but all of which is sorely out of date. And so some mechanism as we think about sharing of not only the completed studies, but the studies that are underway or in planning, and being able to track and share that level of detail, even if it is just what states you involved, or even better, how you engage with those states. I agree that that can go a really far way towards addressing one of our largest policy hurdles right now, while in parallel, as Devin said, you know, figuring out how do we navigate around fixing some of those, some of that gap between the state and the federal oversight.
One comment. I think some of the state laws that strike us as silly came about with good intention of preventing certain harms. And we need to understand what the harms are, and if we advocate for simplifying the rules, at least understand what harms you have either addressed or not addressed, so that they can be called out and people can make informed choice, that there's a risk of a certain thing happening if my genetic data leaks. I'm not protected against certain kinds of discrimination, for example. So call out the harms before you change the silly laws.
Can I ask, does a safe harbor? I don't know what a safe harbor is, particularly in hurricane seasons. But can that be suggested at state levels or some level as a shortcut to getting this done? Because Devin, I just asked, she won't run for Congress. And so these issues are probably never going to come up at a congressional level. But it sounds like that, you know, there might be a shorter cut to recommend people to create some, whatever the safe harbor thing is, to allow, you know, innovation, because it's really, I mean, just the drug dispensing issue alone is a sufficient damper on the costs of innovations if you're not a Science 37 with a big investment. You know, some of us are going to be really hampered by that. So if there was a safe harbor that the states could buy into, whatever that means, you know, it's going to happen faster than changing Congress.
I mean, it's theoretically possible that a safe harbor could be created and then states could choose whether or not to implement that, right? That's been proposed on the professional licensure side, right? It's way easier to carry your gun from Illinois to Florida than it is to carry your nail technician certification, right? Just a non-theoretical example, right? So you have this kind of safe harbor for gun transfer, right, in a way that you don't have it for professional licensure. So it is possible, you know, but it's, you know, what does that do to the person in, you know, so I'll use my home. So I grew up in East Tennessee, right? I'm a National Labs kid. What does that do to Tennessee residents whose state doesn't adopt that in terms of disadvantagement, right? Versus putting our energy towards a federal safe harbor of some sort. I like the safe harbor because it limits the potential damages that could come from the new process, because you can shut the safe harbor much more easily than you can undo a piece of legislation that creates a general rule. Because there will be harms that come with this. There will be new harms that come with this move to the process, right? Nothing's perfect. And I like that because it gives us a chance to explore and validate methods and see them as a balance of benefits and risks. But it is possible to do it at the state level, right? If you're going to do that, in my experience, you sort of need New York and California and Texas. And then people chase, right? Like educational policy is basically dominated by Texas, California, and New York's purchasing systems. So there are high leverage ways to go through the state legislatures, but it would take a lot of coordination of a lot of groups in a lot of places at the same time that might be, NP hard.
John, I have a question about that. Have you observed examples of that happening at the state level? So there is this organization, the name of which I can't...
NASEM, probably? National Association of State Legislators.
No, it's an organization for uniform state laws, and it is very slow and plodding. But when they come to a agreement, the 50 states pick it up like that. Okay, so we did this on genetics. I've done it on a few issues, and it is so slow and plodding. You just want to pull your hair out. But having done federal law, it is also, it's more energetic, right? And I don't know, at the end of the day, do you pursue both of those? Is there a state option that's outside of this group whose name I can't think of? For uniform state laws. Have you ever seen that happen where you get California, New York, Texas, and Massachusetts to do something?
Not as complex as what we're talking about. It's really like I know it mainly through the Open Educational Resources movement, which was really targeting those states to begin enacting state level policy to purchase openly licensed textbooks. Right, because then you could update the textbooks without having to spend the money on the next edition of the textbook. And so it was targeting those 3 states because their purchasing drove the vast majority of the textbook industry's choices. So it's not a very effective comp.
Yeah, I wanted Noah Kraft from Science 37 again. I wanted to follow on a couple comments just to react to them from Steve, Craig, and David in particular. At Science 37, it's true we've enjoyed the support of some courageous investors, and a lot of that got put into a lot of attorneys to craft the understanding of the telemedicine laws across all 50 states and how they dynamically change every single state year by year. There are some great organizations that provide, one was mentioned earlier, that provide kind of an updated version of them. There are law firms that keep track of all of that stuff, which make it a lot cheaper to just consult with those telemedicine-based law firms. Most of our activity at Science 37 is built around a core practice of telemedicine. Our company was built on the backs of a sister company that does telemedicine across the country in general. Understanding the rules of the road is critical to this if you want to do it at scale. Aside from what John just mentioned, which is California, Texas, New York, Illinois, and Florida give you 37% of the U.S. population with 5 states. And those all 5 now have favorable telemedicine laws. So that's important to know, is it's pretty easy to get to 100 million patients with 5 states. And so that's one way to chip into it very quickly. The second thing I wanted to comment on is, and part of our goal at Science 37 is to interact with groups like CTTI and share our learnings. Some of them are considered corporate secret sauce, but most of them, we try to share them as we go. And one of the critical things to understand is the architecture of who are you when you're acting on in any one moment. And the key to what we do at Science 37 is we are the actual physicians. And when you're the actual physician, you have incredible leeway to do what's right for your patient. And that overcomes a lot of the challenges you might feel as a vendor or as an organization. It allows you to understand the laws of shipping drugs to your patients or prescribing things to patients across state lines, or to giving orders to nurses in different states. So when you come from the perspective of you're the physician, and no matter where your patient is, you have a duty and an obligation to care for them, and the rules of the road are shifted towards favoring that patient-doctor relationship, that can craft some attorney's interpretation of where the boundaries of what you're doing are constructed. And not everyone understands that, but that's an important shift to think about when you build trials for patients. Like, we've had patients go to Mexico and something happens in Mexico. We still have a duty to actually care for them and understand what's happening in light of the trial. They're going to come back, they're going to go on vacation to Texas, et cetera. And so those are some nuances of this conversation that if you craft what you're doing around that and then pay attention to all the other restrictions not to cross pharmacy boards or medical boards or FDA rules or et cetera, it's kind of an important understanding that unleashes a little bit more of what you know you can do for your patients, I should say.
Great. And this is, I'm not an investor in Science 37 in any way, but it is true that with complex things like this, we have relied on aggregators of the skill sets for clinical trials in general. So CROs are used very, very widely, and they bring expertise, the knowledge. They become a repository of that knowledge, and that's why they're used so frequently. So, as we learn more, we're going to see aggregators of that knowledge show up. It sounds like IQVIA is another one that wants to be in that position, Science 37. And so that also, I think, helps us with this knowledge base. How is it propagated forward? Because some of this is not publishable. It's not going to be brought into specific detail, and it's placating a specific element, right? It's the lawyers within a sponsor's institution. They want to talk to lawyers. They don't want to read a paper. And so some of that is going to be around that aggregated knowledge and expertise. Okay, so I'm going to then try to do my own aggregation here. So it sounds like we've touched on some ways to move policies forward. That one of the biggest frustrations is the differences between states, whether it's drug distribution or how data is shared or how genetic information is shared. And that it sounds like there are really a couple of strategies, neither of which is all that attractive. At least from up here. One is a federal approach, and I think the point was made it needs to come from the patient side. So that would mean actually investing a lot. It can't be sponsors pushing on. It has to come from that side. I think that's really interesting. I think that would be worth discussing in the drug forum. Actually, we do have organizations that represent patient groups that are there at the drug forum. At least that conversation could start there. That would then get pushed out, but that would be an interesting thing to discuss. Beyond that, I don't know if there's any other legislation where this just gets tagged onto it. I mean, the 21st Century Cures Act, there's an opportunity to put in little things that would have solved this, right? So when's the next one of those? When's the 21st and a quarter Century Cures Act coming out? Can we tag some stuff into that? Does anyone know or any inkling of when that would be? Okay, so maybe we're not ready for that. So that's the federal side. On the state side, I think it sounds like a mess. Great, 5 states. We can get a third. I think that's the figuring out individually for those 5. Yeah, but boy, changing state law in Texas, I just can't imagine how that's going to go. And that's only one of the states, right? So I haven't heard any real points of follow-up on the state side.
Safe harbor?
Well, I guess the safe harbor. I don't know that that's really a. The only thing would be Leonard. You didn't want to comment on this before, so we shouldn't force you to now. But it is it possible, Steve, I think you made this point, is it possible for the FDA to create guidance on study, drug, and placebo that would at least address it as something different than a typical medical product? And I don't know if that's Devin, are you going to comment on that? Or?
Well, I wasn't sure. I was coming up to talk about sort of state law and safe harbors, and then I wasn't sure that it met that last question, but
yeah.
I might have
Well,
miss the connection.
That is a well, the connection. It's a conceptually I get it, but I can see why it wouldn't work too. It would be to say drug and placebo for trials is something different than distributing drug for patient use.
I see.
Is there a way that the FDA could say something that says the way it regulates state to state transport of drug, that it's done differently for investigational products?
Which would help. Mm-hmm. It's unclear whether it gets you all the way to the finish line, because I think it would depend on the state licensure boards deciding that they agreed with that interpretation. I don't know enough about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to know if there's any preemption language in it at all, but given that my suspicion is that there is not, at least not globally, with respect to regulation of drugs, although licensure versus approval to dispense are two different things. So as I mentioned when we were discussing this a little bit on the panel, preemption is a power that Congress has. An administrative body, even in the federal government, can't stand up and say, here's my rule, and all you states can't regulate in this space because I've regulated in this space. Unless they've got the backing of Congress that said, oh, we're gonna essentially preempt state law, or we're giving clearly the authority to the administration to sort of be in this space and no others can be there. And there's, and they have to articulate reasons so that it's constitutionally permissible to do that, because believe it or not, in the Constitution, actually all the power devolves to the states except for that which is reserved to the federal government. So, but through interstate commerce, et cetera, the federal government gets pretty far down the road of being able to regulate in the spaces where it wants to be. But it's really, to get a preemption, you need for Congress to say something. Having said that, it could be a very powerful statement and very persuasive to state boards where the federal government takes a position and says, here's how we're going to interpret this space. It is very persuasive at the state level and can be very effective. It's not entirely clear it gets you all the way there, but my opinion, some other lawyers on the phone or here in the room may disagree, but I think that could be incredibly powerful. Safe harbor is a little bit different. So safe harbor is something that says to actors, hey, if you follow certain criteria, then you are potentially exempt from having to follow what would otherwise be an applicable law to you, right? You're safe harbored out of state law was an example. Or if you follow the certain steps, then we're going to deem you to be in compliance with federal law, and we will provide you with a safe harbor around enforcement, assuming that you have taken properly all the steps that you're required to take for the safe harbor. So there are safe harbor possibilities, but again, Congress has to create them in a way that actually preempts state law across the board. States would then, if without that, then states have to decide, okay, we agree. We agree that the federal guidelines in this space are enough for us, and we're okay if you follow those. We're okay if you do that, right? So it's slightly complicated, but again, there's sort of multiple pathways that can be pursued. Probably the path of least resistance is the one where the federal government makes a pronouncement that's enormously helpful, that again doesn't overturn state law, but has the effect of being enormously persuasive. Mm-hmm. And it's uniform law commissioners, Kathy.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, if I could follow, that was super helpful, and it reminded me I wanted to tie together comments that David made a minute ago with that. What you were just mentioning is a fantasy I've had since we started this company, is a carve-out at the federal level, which one example of a successful carve-out at the federal level is around state licensure for physicians is the VA. So when you work as a physician at the VA, you can work at any VA in the country and take care of those patients that are uniform patients. And that carve-out was at the federal level to overpower state licensure rules, and everyone, I guess, agreed to it. I don't know the history of it, but that's one example where there's a carve-out, and you're not threatening anyone else's business by taking care of patients at the VA. To David's point, the reason that some of the, quote, silly laws were put into place was to protect against other things. For telemedicine laws, and particularly related to internet-based prescribing, there are two known things from our perspective to protect against. One was the rise of crazy online prescribing without ever talking to patients, which is an enormous danger to patients sometimes. Also, it gets a little wild. But it's real, and so some laws were designed to protect against online prescribing chaos. The other is, I want to be careful about how to present this, is certain states wanted to protect against physicians from outside that state taking care of patients inside that state. So it's a business protective space. You realize very quickly if you create that protectionism, you're actually denying your patients a fair amount of access to other physicians and to good care. So most states, including Texas, have come around to understand that that protectionism doesn't help themselves or their patients. So those are two examples of protectionism. But the fantasy I have is the carve-out is telemedicine-based clinical research generally is not going to threaten much of anyone's business. You're not stealing the patients, for example. They're staying where they are. You're not threatening a huge body of business, which is the general practice of medicine. It's a tiny sliver. And if you wanted to make the sliver even smaller to get a foot in the door, you could carve out complete blanket authority for telemedicine-based clinical research for rare disease. Then you're really not threatening anyone's business anywhere. You're demonstrating that one physician could take care of 20 patients around the whole country who have rare disease. You're the only expert in the country who can practically take care of them. And so that would be a foot in the door that it doesn't seem like any side of the aisle or the AMA or anyone else would really fight with, is to do clinical research for rare disease through telemedicine-based approaches. And that would provide a blanket stepping stone to, okay, perhaps we could do compacts where you can do clinical research by telemedicine across state line for general clinical research. At a certain point, organizations will start to feel threatened, I think, but they could become part of it and therefore extend their own reach to other states. So that's a fantasy maybe we could pursue as a group, is to really put that kind of legislative thought into motion.
And just to build on that, I'll go back to the point I made at the start of the meeting. I do believe that when we are able to follow these models, it creates revenue opportunities for local treating physicians to participate in ways that are simply not available to them today. Where local treating physicians today really only have two choices: send your patients to some other physician who's an investigator, or become an investigator themselves. As we think about these models and how they can complement traditional practices, the idea of this centralized investigator can actually create opportunities rather than take those away. Just to build on Noah's point, from the review of a few years ago, my recollection was that among all the state boards of medicine and pharmacy that we had looked at, I believe there was only one, maybe two, in the country that even mentioned investigational product. So their laws, their policies, their practices were not even written with clinical trials in mind. It's just a consequence that no one else has regulation and oversight over investigational medicines. So, well, obviously the FDA does, but in terms of them in the context of distribution, where the FDA looks back to the state. So in terms of anyone feeling that their cheese is being moved or taken away from them, in most cases, those boards didn't even plan for investigational medicines. Those are just lumped in with other medicines that they're regulating around.
Yeah, just one comment on that. Both the last two comments just struck me as something that I thought of earlier yesterday, was that an economic analysis of where the money flows was missing from any of our discussion. And if you want to find out what resistance you're going to have to change, is figure out where the money flows. And if you want to change things, enable the money to flow somewhere else. it's just the way our medical system works. This kind of mutual standoff of all the parties is governed by where the money flows. So an analysis of the economics of traditional trials versus, what are we calling them now, modern trials, 21st century trials, has got to have an economic analysis as part of that, at least at a high level. Otherwise, you won't know who your enemies are to making progress.
So actually, I had a take off on that, and maybe I'll look at it as more as an opportunity than a challenge, but reimbursement. So we're in a patient's world now. In a lot of worlds, yes, investigation's supposed to be covered, but standard of care isn't, and patients cannot potentially go from one state to another and expect to get reimbursed for that care, telemedicine or otherwise. So there's another audience or potential obstacle or challenge out there that we're not thinking about. Or maybe we could talk about value.
I don't want to keep taking up the air in the room, but just experientially, this one of the observations that happened to us at Science 37 was we didn't realize until we were a couple years in that we had decoupled healthcare from research. So in general, anyone can participate in our trials because they don't need insurance. Every single thing about being in our trial is covered for the trial, and that solves one problem, meaning anyone can participate from anywhere. It creates another problem, which is outside of the trial, what happens to that patient, or after the trial, what happens to that patient. We've taken the approach that it's still better than nothing, and it's a move in the right direction, because those patients didn't have anything at all before we got involved. They didn't, so they still have the same access before, during, and after for external care. We decided we couldn't solve the healthcare problems of the country as a starting point. And that notion about the economic analysis, I think, comes back to the local doctors, to what Craig was talking about. There's both the physician and the organization that's involved in the economic impact of what we do in trials. So I won't say what organization, but there are major institutions that won't take patients into trials because they directly compete with the ancillary services outside the trial. So if the RVUs for that patient go down because you're in a trial, they won't accept that patient into a very important trial because the organization loses a slight margin, which is very disappointing. To the local physicians, Craig's point is spot on around if you provide a ancillary service above the standard of care, so the local doctor continues to stay involved, continue to maintain their relationship, and importantly, maintain their revenue from insurance or otherwise. That adding to the local healthcare system is one way that this sells through as an additional kind of benefit rather than a detractive benefit like trials do.
Good. I just have one more that I just want to throw out and see if anybody wants to grab it. Ray Dorsey had to leave, so he's not here, but he mentioned governance is another issue, and this kind of came up too, well, at least he put it in the same basket as making sure there was a patient representative on IRBs. But he was talking more broadly too about governance and how we bring patients into decision-making around design and all of that as well. I have trouble coming up with the next step for that. We just had a new common rule, right? So it's unlikely we're going to be rewriting the common rule anytime soon.
Do we have one still? Is it actually?
Is it out now, or is it still hung up?
It's delayed. It's implementation.
We have it.
We have it.
So we have it.
We've had it for a long time.
Right. So, but not likely that we're going to slide in just one more clause in there before it gets disseminated. So I think we could make recommendations. We could have a statement that that's something that we think makes sense, particularly as we move to these non-site-based trials. But is there anything else anybody wants to say about this before we leave it?
Is this a virtual trials topic? Though I keep going back in my mind thinking these are just good best practices for any study, site-based or otherwise.
That's when it was first proposed. That was my conclusion too. The way Ray said it, though, and he's right, is that we are, because of the issues about disconnecting healthcare from the trial, that there's actually more risk now than there has been previously by not incorporating those views. But I don't.
So I think Craig is absolutely right that this is a general issue, but there's no reason why it can't be said here that particularly when these trials must be more engaging of participants than run by, I don't see any harm in putting in at least the recommendation for inclusion on the DSMB and bring that to NIH's attention, because NIH can much more easily insert or recommend that across individual institutes, I think, than you can change the common rule.
So I'm going to build on that and amend my last statement that it's all general, because you're right, it isn't. And in fact, I think that people risk making the assumption that simply by shifting the location for their trials, now they're being more patient-centric. And without actually engaging diverse patients around, in that indication, around the realities of this type of a location shift, they'll miss the point that maybe there are some patients, some demographics, some cultures within their patient population that this is going to be incredibly disruptive to their lives. And so I do think that there are probably special considerations for this type of decentralized virtual approach that reinforce the need for engaging with diverse patients in the planning of one's study to make sure that the assumptions people are making actually apply for their study.
John and I were talking out in the hallway about how it's easy to talk about having patients engaged and how it's much harder to do in an important way. So we have made a commitment. We're going to have patients everywhere doing everything. We have a working group right now that's working on a global linkage method, and we don't have a patient on that group. And I don't want to just plunk patients on that group who can't use hash and salt in a sentence not referring to breakfast. So it's hard to do, and there's not a lot of resources out there to say, here's what meaningful engagement means. Here's how to appropriately do bi-directional training for everybody who's involved in that to make it work. It's just a very hard problem, and it's probably a harder problem for virtual studies than for modern studies than traditional ones.
If I can reinforce the point I made earlier about the need for a new, maybe it's not new, but capacity. Because this patient-focused drug development, it's not because I'm so special. I get at least 3 or 4 emails a week to come and speak or articulate the patient voice. They really don't have a capacity of trained, we need like job descriptions, not necessarily a union, but we need an organized capacity to make patient-focused drug development and 21st century cures work. And some people need to know more about this virtual. We need modern patient advocates. We had to learn a lot back in the day so that we got a seat at the table. There's no capacity for that. So there's all these open positions that can't be just check the box anymore. And I really believe that one of the recommendations needs to be funding for capacity of the, I don't know if we call it the patient voice, the public voice, but it's really necessary because everybody talks about it, but nobody's really putting the budget for the community in it.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. In the Children's Oncology Group, we have to train the patient advocates. I mean, there's no way for them to be effective, as helpful to design those trials without actually a year onboarding. Right, and so we have to double up every position so we can get them onboarded. It's absolutely right. It's just not fair, but we need them in the room, but they have to be onboarded.
So just to continue piling on to the point, this is the same thing when it comes to data access, because frequently it's a very sort of easy dodge to say, we'll give you back your data. What if you can't do anything with it? And the value of it's in the aggregate. And then you say, well, we're going to let you into the portal and you can ask questions like any other scientist. But if you don't know how to write code in R or Python, right? So the capacity building has to be up and down the spectrum, because the reality is most scientists get rewarded on whether or not they hit their specific aims, which are not, they're going to be often orthogonal. They might be fundamental biology, not related to treatment. And so if we're going to have the open science part of this actually be transformative, the capacity has to go into teaching patients to have data scientists in their community who can take advantage of the open aspects. Otherwise, it's a way of sort of dodging the issue and sort of draining the energy that would otherwise go into changing the system.
Right. I agree with absolutely all of that. I'm going to raise a slightly different spin on this. The idea that the patient engagement, which agreed is hard, agreed resources dedicated to it, to training people, to paying them to attend things so that they can actually come, is absolutely essential. I'm going back to the statistics, Kathy, that you started your panel with, and how abysmal they are with respect to inclusion of underrepresented populations. And even though there isn't necessarily anything unique about a modern trial versus a traditional trial, in terms of the challenges of getting more diverse populations of people to both be studied and also to have input into trials. But where are the opportunities that come with this version of trials, where more of that data collection can be at home, where there is more opportunity to go directly to participants? Does that give us, doesn't raise different issues, but does it raise up new opportunities to change those statistics? I think that we need to think about it that way as opposed to the flip side, or both.
I wanted to just emphasize that point again by saying that I think it's a little bit analogous to user testing of products and websites and that sort of thing, that when you're talking about something that people are interacting with directly, not in front of a doctor who can monitor whether the interaction is effective, you really need to have good testing, and we need to have an infrastructure that can support that testing. And potentially even approval by such bodies that the design of the trial is culturally sensitive and isn't likely to result in adverse events and that sort of thing. So I do think it's more important in this type of a virtual trial to have a lot of participant input.
All right, well, I'd like to thank all of you for contributing to the discussion and giving us a lot to think about, a lot of action items to follow up and have subsequent discussions with the Drug Forum. And this has been an incredibly productive meeting in terms of learning and figuring out next steps for how we can really improve clinical trials in the next century. And I would like to thank Rebecca and Ishan for all of their work in putting this together, as well as my co-chair and the planning committee.